All right. Well, thank you for everybody for joining. It's good to see, especially the old friends. Also, very nice to see a member of my own pledge class. Hey, Carter, way to represent. And figure I'll just jump right in. So my plan is I'm going to talk first a little about what we do in the State Department and diplomacy, uh, what what how we try to achieve our goals, move on to a little bit of some of the techniques we use in diplomacy, and then I'll give sort of a brief overview of where I've been and where I've been posted, and then give a couple detailed case studies to give you a feel for maybe what diplomacy is like. First, the work I did in Sudan, and then the work I did in the negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And then I'd like to open up to questions, and in the question and answer period, feel free to sort of ask me whatever you want, and I'll either answer the question or I'll dodge it so artfully that you won't notice that I didn't answer it. So, well, let me just launch right in. So, I think a lot of people are more familiar with what the military does. So let's start by sort of talking about the difference between the State Department mission and the military mission, because we have complementary. We work very close together, and we're both different aspects of foreign affairs. But in general, the military, they always say their goal, and for if any of you are in the military, you know, it's to fight and win America's wars. And they're very clear on that, and that's what they're best at. In diplomacy, we enable American prosperity, and I'll talk a little bit what that means. And a big part of our job is to prevent wars. There's an old military strategist, Clausewitz, who said that you may have heard the quote that war is the continuation of diplomacy by other means. Well, I mean, the flip side is also true, which is war is when you have to continue, you have to use other means because diplomacy has failed. And there's times that I can talk a little about what and why diplomacy fails and how it fails. If I can get to the next slide. So these are the general goals in the State Department. First and foremost is to help Americans in need. And this is when travelers get into trouble, and this can be a whole range of things. Sometimes not in trouble, sometimes people just need a passport renewal, but also visiting Americans in prison. If American gets hospitalized and we hear about it, which depending on the size of the country, we may or may not, we'll send someone to help. We'll make sure they get in touch with their family. It's a whole range of things. We can help Americans, repatriate Americans, send them back home if they've run out of money. So there's a wide range of services, and that's, we consider our most important job at the embassy, even though fortunately Americans aren't in desperate need all that often. So it's not necessarily the most time-consuming job, but it's definitely our most important job. If you've been following the news about evacuating all of these Americans, and maybe you've read some stories about where there's trouble, it's because right now it's really hard. But I have friends who have been working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, literally evacuating thousands of Americans out of their country, chartering flights, convincing the government to let airplanes in, even though the country's locked down, convincing charters to fly airplanes in, making sure that there's doctors available on both ends, and a wide range of things. It's incredibly complicated, and I'm very proud of my friends and colleagues who've been doing it so successfully. And then, as I mentioned, prevent attacks against American interests. So when America gets attacked from overseas, that is, in a way, a failure of diplomacy in any way. The most obvious example, of course, is 9/11. So my 9/11 was my second day on the job in the State Department. So my first day was September 10th, 2001. On September 9th, 2001, I moved from an apartment in New York City with a view of the World Trade Towers into an apartment in Virginia with a view of the Pentagon. But I also know and saw firsthand how we were scrambling to scale up in Afghanistan. in the 90s, there were dramatic budget cuts to the State Department, and we had to start picking and choosing where we thought the biggest threats were, where we were watching carefully, and where we weren't. And Afghanistan was pretty close to the bottom of the list. We knew there were bad guys there. We knew there were guys there that intended to do us harm, but the prevalent wisdom at the time was there's a lot of threats coming from a lot of places, and what can people in a fairly primitive society on the other end of the other side of the world do to us? So that was very much a failure of diplomacy. You never hear about all of our successes. We have a lot more successes than failures. You know, I often say in diplomacy, our failures are front page news, and our successes nobody ever hears about, because if we succeed, nothing has happened. We also work to help countries develop. This is partially because we're nice people. I think as Americans, I think we're nice people, but it's also because it's good for America. It's good for American security. Developed countries are less likely to attack the United States. There's an old idea that two countries that had a McDonald's have never attacked each other. That was true for a long time, but both Russia and the Ukraine have McDonald's. We can no longer say that. But I will say that developed countries are far less of a threat. But the other reason we want countries to develop is because we want to sell them our stuff. We've got nice stuff, but our stuff tends to be kind of expensive. You know, we want to sell companies high value, high profit American goods. We want to sell them jets and manufacturing equipment. In order to buy that, they need to have a certain level of development. So there's a definite self-interest, economic self-interest in that too. And that sort of goes to the next one, create conditions for American investment. And we do that on a whole range, from trying to convince the country to have laws that are friendly to foreign investment, to actually working with American companies and local governments to try to get American businesses involved in making money in the country. And then finally, a big part of our mission is to get people to like America and to promote common values. Again, it's partially because we're nice people. The values that we're promoting are universal human rights and things that make people's lives better, but also if people like America, they are more likely to work with us, more likely to work with our businesses, and less likely to attack us. So that's sort of where the State Department fits into American prosperity and American security. So how do we do this? I mean, there's a wide range. We have programming that we do to build up, but at its core, and my end of the diplomacy spectrum, is just making an argument. So basically, my job is to talk to people, talk to governments, and convince those governments to do things they wouldn't otherwise do just by talking to them. If I hadn't seen it work, I would think that that was sort of ridiculous, that there's no way that could possibly work. You know, I might ask, like, okay, if they don't do what we say, can we shoot them? The answer is no. Well, sometimes, very rarely, can we shoot people. Mostly, it's just by talking to them. So, you know, so at its core, diplomacy is making an argument. And so we work to develop messages that are clear, that tell the country exactly what we want, and why it's good for everybody. Short, it has to be short because it's going to be repeated all over, has to be memorable, and true. The power of truth is really strong. Diplomats who try to, and countries that try to use lies to forward their diplomacy are not particularly successful. And that goes to credibility. They have to be credible. And what does credibility mean? It means they have to believe you. So as a diplomat, I can never lie because people have to believe what I say. If my words are really the only tool I have, they have to believe those words. So how do I make myself credible? And that's based on the kind of relationship. Often it's said diplomacy is relationships. and that's this part of it. People believe messages from people they trust. So relationships can be based on friendship. I know a lot of diplomats, they go out and they're the kind of guys that everybody wants to have a beer with, and they make great friends with foreign government officials, and they hang out with them, and that's credible. That's not really my approach. Probably don't have to let a lot of you know that I'm not the coolest guy in the world. I'm not the one that's going to be like, oh yeah, everybody wants to hang out with that dude. So I have to take a different approach. So I build my credibility based on me showing that I know what I'm talking about. So when I meet a new contact, I try to say something really super smart in that first conversation. And that sort of establishes that I know what I'm talking about. There are other types of relationships. When we call in a retired senator to do negotiations, a state governor comes in to do negotiations, that's a type of relationship, a president, because there's a certain gravitas that comes with that. So, you know, they don't know that person at all personally, a former senator, but they know as a former senator that carries weight, and that establishes a degree of credibility. And then finally, where we often fall down is it has to be repeated all the time, everywhere. So when I develop a clear message, you know, that's one reason I want it short, to sort of win the game of telephone. I tell it to everybody. I tell it to, you know, my contacts in the government. I put it in the ambassador's talking points to say to the president of the country. I say it to people on the street. I say it to my local fruit vendor. You know, I was once talking about that with a friend of mine who's also an experienced diplomat, and she was saying, oh, you know, it's funny you say that. She's like, I remember getting some clothes tailored when I was working, she said, when she was working in the Congo, and started talking about some things and talking about what the US is trying to do. And the tailor's like, oh, you know, my brother is the vice president. Let me give him a call right now. And then she was talking to the vice president, repeating her message. And the idea is you want to get an echo chamber. I feel like ideally, when a decision is being made, that people are sitting around the room and they've all heard from people, from me, or, you know, other people from the embassy. They don't even necessarily know it's from us. There's like a buzz in the air where it's like, what should we do? And one person at the meeting says, oh, the Americans suggested this. And somebody else goes, yeah, you know, I've heard a lot about that. Yeah, everybody's talking about that being a good idea. And maybe all of that can be traced back to us at the embassy. We've created this this buzz. We're never going to be in the room. We can never know for sure who or when that decision is going to be made and by whom. So we just have to keep repeating it over and over again. It's like Wanamaker, famous department store owner from the turn of the 20th century. He famously said, half of all my advertising is totally wasted, but I don't know which half, so I'm going to continue with all of it. Truth is, in diplomacy, 90% of my messaging is probably totally wasted. But I don't know which 90%. And that 10% tends to work. So that's sort of the general of what we do and how we do it. I'll now kind of go over the tours that I've had, sort of in order. So my very first tour was Gabon, which is right on the equator on the west coast of Africa. That was really amazing, very different. I joined the State Department because I wanted to see exotic places. And as a kid who grew up in Tucson, Arizona, in the deserts, the jungles of Central Africa were about as different from that as I could imagine. Obviously without being cold, because I don't really want to be cold. So staying warm, and it was very different, but it was very exciting. So a lot of what we did in Gabon was environmental work. George W. Bush had a huge environmental program, the Congo Basin Forest Partnership. And as part of that, we convinced the Gabonese to set aside 10% of their land as national parks, and then to make that real national parks. And it was exciting because Gabon is actually mostly virgin rainforest. So it's different from other environmental work where you're trying to sort of triage or stop damage that's already started. We were trying to get in ahead of the loggers and the forest clear cutting. So we convinced them to set aside their land as national park, but it takes a lot of work to actually manage national parks. And then we worked with them on that. My second tour was in the Bahamas. That was really beautiful. It wasn't exactly where I wanted to go. Our first two tours are directed, and then after that, we have a little more choice about where we're going. Uh, Again, it was beautiful. It was nice. It wasn't as exotic as what I was looking for. Bahamas was my consular tour. So consular is the job where you're helping American citizens. Every foreign service officer has to know how to do consular work. And so one of your first two tours, you're going to do at least a year of consular work. So in the mornings, I issued visas or did visa interviews, whether I issued or not depended. And then in the afternoon was focused on helping American citizens. And that included, again, passports and routine stuff, but also a lot of people, especially during spring break, would get drunk and get themselves into trouble in these bars in the Bahamas. I spent a lot of time visiting jails of American kids whose friends told them that drugs were totally legal in the Bahamas. So I would visit them in jail and let them know that, no, dude, they're totally not. But also reassure them. They had a catch and release program. The kids spent the night in a pretty clean jail and then paid a fine and left the Bahamas the next day. So made sure they were in touch with their parents or their family who could pay the fine, make sure they could pay the fine and make sure that they're okay and reassured. Also, because of the nature of the Bahamas, a lot of people, it's their first time overseas. They're not used to traveling overseas, especially young women. So there was a risk there. So I spent a lot of time talking with bar and restaurant owners about ways they could help keep Americans safe, meeting with tour groups who came out, also working with the police department to help link them up and get programs that would have them better investigate sexual assault cases. And also I pushed the police department very hard on investigating the sexual assaults. And as a result of me pushing them, they actually made an arrest of a serial predator. So I was very proud of that and proud of that work. However, overall, it wasn't as exotic as I was looking for. It wasn't what I felt I signed up to do. So after a year, I volunteered to leave the State Department, to leave the Bahamas and move to Khartoum, Sudan. That was one of the best decisions I've ever made. It was right after they signed the North-South peace agreement that ended their civil war. And I was sent there to help implement the peace agreement and help us open our first ever diplomatic post in South Sudan. South Sudan is now an independent nation as part of the end of that peace process, so it's an embassy now. And that was really exciting. For one thing, you know, people a lot of times when peace agreements are signed, they think it's over and everybody celebrates, but actually you're about, at best, halfway done. Implementing peace agreements are as hard and usually harder than getting them negotiated. So there were a few touch and go moments down there. There was where it seemed like the war was gonna reignite. I also worked with the government to just advise them on how to be a government. So I was the face of the US government. So I had to contact a lot of the people who really knew what they were talking about back in Washington, learn a lot about how to set up a government, and then pass that along to the Sudanese. In one particular case, in terms of stopping the return to war, a warlord reached out and said he wanted to meet with me as the US government representative of South Sudan. He was a warlord who hadn't joined the peace agreement, so we were a little concerned about him. And I went ahead, it was a little, made me a little nervous, but I went ahead and agreed to meet with him and was driven to this isolated location. And I met the first of what turned out to be many warlords. And I find that African warlords, when you talk to them, they always begin the same way. They always say some variation of, I'm a man of peace. I just want peace. And I just kill all these people because I have to. That sort of sums up their discussion. But he didn't want to join the peace agreement. He didn't trust either of the parties to the agreement. But I did convince him that he was a little worried that the US was going to send in the special forces to take him out. We definitely were not going to do that. I didn't necessarily tell them we definitely weren't going to do that. You know, I say we always have to tell the truth, but in diplomacy, I know your mom always said if you leave something out, that's the same as lying. That's not the way it works in diplomacy. Our messages are very carefully encoded to say very specifically what we say is true. And, you know, sort of the rules of diplomacy is if you misinterpreted that to mean something else, as long as exactly what I said is true, that's your fault, not mine. So I didn't bring up that we weren't going to send in the special forces. Definitely didn't tell them we were, but convinced them to join the ceasefire mechanism as a non-party to the peace treaty. And about 6 months later, fighting broke out between his militia and a rival militia. There was literally tank battles in the streets of their town. But because he was a member of the ceasefire mechanism, what could have been a restart of the Civil War turned out to be calmed relatively quickly. So I felt good about the role I played in that as well. And that's what happens in diplomacy. You do things that other people have started, you move the ball along. You know, people ask me on tours, was it a successful tour? Usually my answer is, I'll tell you in 10 years, because that's how long it takes. I then went back to Washington to work on Darfur. There was a Darfur peace agreement signed. That didn't go so well. You can't win them all, I guess, is that. After that, went to Israel, and I'll talk a little more about Israel in a bit. And then when President Obama rejoined the UN Human Rights Council, I was lucky enough to be put in charge of the small team that was sort of on the ground in Geneva and Washington, trying to get resolutions passed, trying to make the Human Rights Council, the UN's main body on human rights, actually function. And it was a challenge, but it was great. We got a human rights monitor on Iran. You know, when there's a UN human rights monitor criticizes Iran's record, it's a lot more credible than the US, which can be dismissed a lot more easily. Human rights issues in North Korea, we just across the spectrum, we focused on human rights things. Didn't carry any of the weight of the law, but it makes a difference. It sets the norms about what's right and wrong. Following Geneva, I did a lot of work in Sri Lanka, in Geneva at the UN, and then went to Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka, they were also post their civil war, but very close to getting back to war. So we worked a lot to stop that from happening. And then also in Sri Lanka, there was a populist president who sort of riled up his base with some very racist language and was undermining democratic institutions. So we supported human rights defenders and activists and shine a light. That's what we talk about in human rights work. We shine a light on problems, and it's harder. It's a lot harder to work. So, you know, we and our partners exposed the human rights issues in that country to the point where there was an election. The president had already gotten rid of term limits, and he was running for his bonus term. Everybody thought he was going to win by a lot, and the people of Sri Lanka voted for the guy who supported human rights and democracy. It's a huge surprise to everyone, but it was a really great outcome. After that, I went to Afghanistan, tried to help the government improve its governance. Also worked on the beginnings of trying to set the stage for negotiations between the Taliban and the Afghan government. So if you see the news now, those talks may be starting. So it's an example of setting something in motion and then years later seeing if it pays off. Who knows? We're still very early. It may not come of it, but our work is slow work. After that, Afghanistan was tough. I was separated from my family. It was great work, but it was hard. My family was in LA while I was there. It's very hard on my wife, Melissa, who a lot of you know. So Melissa wanted to be reunited in someplace super family friendly. I wanted to get back to work on Africa because I love Africa. I love the African people. We compromised. I became a political advisor to the military in Stuttgart, Germany, beautiful place to live. And I advised on all the strategies and policies in Africa. very different from what I usually was doing. Didn't talk to any governments, didn't represent the United States, only talked to the military, but basically worked as a consultant, giving them advice on how to be more effective. So that's sort of the broad interview. That's the broad overview. That's the kind of stuff I do. And then really briefly, I'll talk a little more in detail. But before I do, just sort of talk about the career progression. One of the things I love is being right at the doorstep of history. I used to joke that my autobiography would be, that's my elbow, because there are all these pictures, where these people are walking out of negotiations, and I tell my family, hey, look at that, you see that photo? That's my elbow on the side, or that's my foot. But you know, as my career has progressed, you know, that's the president of Afghanistan, that's Secretary of State John Kerry, the ambassador to Afghanistan. This is the President Obama's advisor on Afghanistan. And there I am, about 3 feet away, taking notes. And they're talking about the issues I was working on. It was, and the briefing papers that I prepared for them. So that was really exciting. And then, so that's 20 years. And then hopefully in another 10 years, I'll be, you know, up at one of these 2 seats. That's sort of the career progression. So Sudan, talked a little about what I was doing in Sudan. Malakal was where the tank battles broke out. I also had to become an expert in looking for oil. That's another thing in the Foreign Service. You're sort of called upon to be an expert in things, just on the fly. They wanted to look for oil in a responsible way, so I had to talk to experts in the Department of Commerce and Department of Interior, oil experts, and take basically a crash course on how to advise them on how to look for oil, as an example. And then, as I mentioned, I also worked somewhat on Darfur. So this is sort of South Sudan. This is what our compound looked like, my bedroom. We were able to sort of fake something that looked kind of diplomatic, even though we were out in little huts. And I did get some time to hang out with friends as we were having beers in our locally purchased matching boo-boos at a bar underneath a mango tree along the Nile. And we were fortunate we had houses. Most of the international people were on canvas tents along the Nile, where, where frequently their big problem was cobras in the showers. The shower was just a pump off the Nile River into an open area. Apparently that's a good environment for cobras. I'm happy to say I had hot water and no cobras. And then the other thing I worked on was Darfur. This is a Darfur refugee camp. You're basically right out there on the Sahara. We were staying in hooches. This is actually not one of our hooches, but similar, except we had sandbags piled up to about there. And I was like, oh, does it flash flood around here? They're like, no, that's in case the shooting starts. Get on the floor, and then maybe the sandbags will stop the bullets. Again, not particularly reassuring, but we knew why we were there, because when flying in, often from the air, I could see burned out villages. Again, I didn't take this picture, but this is basically what it looked like looking out of your window. So, you know, we want to help people. We want to make the world a safer place. And, you know, if the world's a safer place, in general, it's better for Americans. In fact, that's really you know, you hear a lot about the international system that we've set up and the threats to the international system. I mean, basically, we've spent, since the end of World War II, setting up an international system that is good for everybody, but hopelessly tilted to our advantage. I liken it to a casino. So a lot of times, and I remember a lot of our military guys, you know, they see China and Russia playing their hands of poker, and they want to sit down and they want to outplay them at poker. And we're probably better poker players than they are. However, we built this international system not so that we could be poker players. We're the house. So, because the house always wins, and that's how we've set up the system. Do we win on every hand? Do we win on every spin of the roulette wheel? No, but we always win in the end. And just like a casino, we've set up our international system so that it's fun to be in the international system, and maybe you can get rich too. And that's why everybody wants to be in our international system. We have to make it fun for everybody, and we have to make sure that people have the opportunity to get rich, and then they'll continue to let us be the house. And so that's a lot of partially what we're doing when we're helping people in Darfur. Again, I like to help people, but we're proving that we're good at being the house, so that people let us keep being the house. Israel, as you might imagine, was a lot more complicated. In Israel, I was involved in negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Obviously, it's a very difficult problem, but I'll tell you a few things that I learned from it right off the bat. One, that long-term conflicts are about human dignity. So the problem in Israel, and the problem in all long-term conflicts, is that people don't feel they can live in dignity. They don't feel like their children can have a better future. One of the things that's really tricky about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is that in most conflicts, it's one side not living in dignity and the other side that refuses to give them dignity. In this conflict, neither side is really able to live fully in dignity. You know, on the Israeli side, they have to live in constant fear, constant real fear of terrorist attacks. And let me tell you, that's no way to go through life. You know, people who live around here always have to keep an eye out 20 seconds from a bomb shelter in case rockets come in. That's no way to live. And on the Palestinian side, you know, there are checkpoints, there are barriers. Just to go to work, they have to be rounded up like this and be searched. It's a daily indignity. They're cut off from their homes and their farmland by walls like this. So both sides have trouble living in dignity. But if you really drill down, about 90% of what a final agreement looks like has already basically been worked out. People know what it's going to look like. Both sides, both Palestinians and Israelis, overwhelmingly want peace. The problem is that there's a small but vocal side on each side that is able to use fear and violence to basically have a veto over that. The other issue is that while 90% is worked out, the most important 10% is Jerusalem, and most particularly the old city of Jerusalem. That's one of the holiest sites in Islam. That is the only holy site for Judaism. You can see they're literally right on top of each other, because this is the retaining wall for the old Jewish temple, and this is the mosque that was built on the site of the Jewish temple. So you literally cannot divide that in any way. And it's super emotional, and it's super emotional for both sides because it represents their ability to have a secure future that they want. You know, when Israel declared independence, the UN came up with a plan to split the area in two, a Jewish state and an Arab state. The Jews agreed to it, the Arabs didn't. The Arabs invaded. They initially were able to take the West Bank. This is a ridge line. This is why it has this sort of funky shape. They're able to basically take the high ground, the ridge line. Jerusalem was important. Israel concentrated their forces and pushed through to Jerusalem, but they were only able to get to this line. They weren't able to get to the old city. This is the line that they could push through to. And basically Jews were cut off from the old city from 1948 to 1967. You know, I was born in 1972, and I was taught to be angry about losing the old city, even though Jews already had access to it. It's super important to both sides, can't draw a line from it. And to be honest, it's really the only problem that we haven't come up with a solution that makes both sides believe they can live in their dignity. So, you know, other than the negotiations, we tried to make progress on other fronts. When I arrived, there were a ton of roadblocks, checkpoints all throughout the West Bank. It was strangling the Palestinian economy. It was angering Palestinians every day. It was creating fertile ground for terrorists. Before I got there, the cliche was take risks for peace. Well, if that risk is somebody blowing themselves up in the middle of your city, that is not a risk that any sane person would take for peace. But we worked with the Israelis, and we brought in security experts and military guys, and we developed for them and worked with them to develop a new way of doing security where they could remove a lot of the checkpoints and roadblocks, where they could let the Palestinians live at least a semi-dignified existence and yet actually make them more secure within Israel. So, it's a small thing, but it improved Palestinians' lives. It made Israelis safer. So I was proud of that little thing that I was a part of, even if we couldn't actually get that peace agreement on the big time. But because of my experience there in Sudan, that's my specialty now: peace agreements, conflict resolution, post-conflict reconstruction. So that's why if you look at the map, I'm sort of going where the conflicts are. So that's the presentation. Probably took a little longer than I intended to go through all that, but like to open up for questions. You can ask me anything about what things are like, what my day is like. You want to hear funny stories about times I got myself into trouble? I got a few of those. Whatever you guys like to hear.
Stein, I just want to say it's great to see you. I haven't seen you in forever. Thank you for doing this. I'm glad you're well. Your life is way more interesting than mine. With that.
Not right now. Right now, my life is basically just in this little apartment. So.
All right. Fair enough. The COVID, the equalizer. So two things. First, kind of sarcastic. Who's found more oil in their life, you or Ragnar?
Ragnar's not on the call, right?
No, so that's why we're talking behind his back.
For more oil being taken out of the ground in Ragnar.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
I'm going to say that, although for Ragnar, in Ragnar's defense, he can draw a direct line of like, he points to the oil here. I mostly just explained to the South Sudanese how to negotiate good oil contracts. So it's a lot more diffuse, as is typical for diplomats.
Yeah, fair enough. And then my other question, a little more serious, was there any concern either personally or from the State Department about a good Jew like yourself being sent to Israel in the middle of not a very stable time?
It's interesting. In fact, for a long time, Jews were not allowed to go to Israel at all because they were afraid of our loyalties, like until the 1970s. They thought we might have split loyalties. It's kind of insulting, and there were some lawsuits over that. But even as a Jew in these areas, and I talked with people who definitely wanted me dead. I had a meeting with some business people in the West Bank to see if there was ways to sort of use business ties for peace. There were definitely a couple people in that room looking at me like they wanted to see me dead. But I think when you're a diplomat, the truth is you're a representative of the United States first. It's actually not that dissimilar. I know a lot of female diplomats serving in the Arab world, serving in Saudi Arabia, where they go to places where women aren't allowed, but they go there to have their meetings, and it's accepted because they're representatives of the United States. So, I think in a way the Palestinians actually, I think, liked that I was Jewish more than the Israelis, because one typical Israeli tactic is if you're really pressing them hard in a meeting and they don't like what you're saying, they bring up the Holocaust. It's almost like you could like ring a bell, like, oh yeah, you ding, 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 so they never did that for me because they knew they couldn't pull that on me. Whereas the Palestinians liked it because they figured if they could convince a Jew to be on their side, maybe there's hope. And that actually fits into what role the U.S. plays. We are on Israel's side. Everybody knows we're on Israel's side. The Palestinians know we're on Israel's side. But sort of the agreement is that the Palestinians also believe we want peace. And in order for us to be effective mediators, the Palestinians have to believe, and I don't know if they do now, but they have to believe that if they signed a peace agreement with the Israelis, they would totally expect the Israelis to ignore it, but they think that the United States, because we're friends with Israel, could force them to follow the peace agreement. And so that's really the role we play. On the Israeli side, we show that we're on their side when often nobody else is. And so that gives them the confidence to sign an agreement to know that the US will make sure that they don't get screwed in a peace agreement they signed. And the Palestinians believe that they know we're pro-Israel, but they believe that means we can force the Israelis to do the work.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Hey,
Yeah,
Mike. Go ahead.
Go ahead. I have a question now. It's just a curiosity. Since I'm not really a Gamma Rho, but I support the chapter in a lot of ways. Have you ever run into David Moran, who's from the British Civil Service?
No, can't say that I have.
I just throw it out there. I initiated him. He's here behind me from Willamette University, and has a long career in the British service, doing the same kind of thing you do. But
yeah, we work a lot with the Brits. Usually they're really like-minded with us, so it's fun to work with them.
so that's why I asked. Crossing paths.
Hey, Mike again. Long time no talk.
Yeah, hey,
Good to see you.
good to see you too.
So first, before I start, similarly, I promised somebody I work with that I would tell you he was in Bati from 2006 through 2008, and he said, quote, that should raise his eyebrows.
Yeah, that was tough. It's a tough time to be there.
He had some crazy stories, so he wanted me to pass that on. So I have two questions, one political, one corporate. The political question, you've worked with multiple presidents.
Yeah.
I will ask this diplomatically. How has your role changed through the years on both sides of the aisle?
So yeah, I mean, I've worked with both Democrats and Republicans. Came in under George W. Bush. The truth is, it actually doesn't change that much. 90% of our foreign policy is there's a bipartisan agreement that we are, promoting American businesses, promoting human rights, promoting American values, which happen to be universal values. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which every country in the world has signed, would look very familiar to all Americans. It's not a coincidence. That's part of the casino that we built, part of the international system. So even this administration, and this administration is as different on foreign policy as any in anybody's memory. It's still 75, 80% the same. So it's only the really high profile issues where it can change. And then also, once you get to the ambassador level, you're sort of swimming a little more in political waters, but it actually doesn't really change that much. It's more of a change in emphasis over a change really in direction. And again, a few of the high profile places, huge radical change on our Israel policy, very different from how things have been under Democratic Republican presidents for decades. We'll have to see how that works out. It's not consistent with common wisdom, but sometimes common wisdom's wrong. We'll see. But in general, it actually really doesn't change that much. Probably the biggest change is when foreigners like our president and trust our president, our job is easier.
Sure.
It makes it easy for us to be liked. And when people don't trust our president, don't like our president, then you sort of have more to overcome in terms of convincing people that what's good for you is what's good for us.
Sure.
So maybe the approach has changed, not the policies.
Cool. On the corporate side, in my role, I certainly deal with a lot of diplomatic issues, especially working with a Japanese-owned company. I'm just curious at the high level, like if you left the public sector and entered the private sector, what are some of your key observations, if you could distill them, to success in the business world based on what you've learned in the geopolitical world?
I guess probably the biggest thing that I've learned is that people are more alike than different. And, you know, a lot of times people like to talk about complexity. They talk about cultural differences, and you have to respect cultural differences. You know, my next tour is going to be Tbilisi, Georgia, which has a sort of frozen conflict with Russia, 20% of their lands being occupied by Russia. And I'm reading all these articles about how, well, we have to remember how complex things are in the Caucasus when we go there. I found in both dealing with international businesses that actually, you know, take the approach that simplify, that they actually want what we want. There are cultural things you have to respect, but think of those cultural things as more the process, as more that you signal that you respect them so that they can respect you, but not that the underlying things people want. You know, they want a better life for their kids. They want to be happy. You know, so I guess my advice people dealing with international businesses is learn the culture, understand the culture, but don't get so caught up in complexity. I find that when you really boil it down, people are very similar, and build your relationship on that. And the cultural stuff is the structure and the form, but when you're going to build a relationship with somebody, it's going to be the same way whether they're Japanese, Afghan, Russian, Congolese, you know, that you that you can trust each other, that you respect each other, and that you want what's best for them and they want what's best for you, and that the best way, convince them that the best way to do that is for you guys to work together on that.
Cool. Thanks.
Any other questions, anybody? No?
Well,
So-
shit, if nobody's going to ask, give us your get in trouble story. Jeez, come on, guys. That's good stuff there.
Yeah, so there's a few times, both for conflict reasons and also just general safety reasons, that I've ended up in a lot of trouble. Funny thing is, often they try to keep us out of trouble. We have whole security services. When I lived in Afghanistan, there were very big walls between me and everybody else. So really, the times to get in trouble is kind of the unofficial times when you're liable to do something stupid. So, you know, in Sudan, in South Sudan, it was really much a lot like the Wild West there. It was brand new. They were just establishing government. There weren't really a lot of respect for laws. A lot of former soldiers that carried their automatic weapons around all the time. There was a cholera and disease outbreaks. There were unexploded ordnance, landmines everywhere. It was a dangerous place. My goal was always, you know, sometimes in service of my country, I'll put myself in dangerous areas, but I didn't want my last thought to be idiot. So, you know, some friends would come and they're like, hey, we've heard there's some really nice hiking in the hills just out of town. I was like, oh, the hills where there are landmines? No, thank you. I'm not going. You know, or, you know, they'd be like, hey, there's this new chicken roasting place opened up in town. You want to go check it out? It's like, during a cholera outbreak? No, I'll stay here. My food flown in from Nairobi. Thank you. Sometimes I would be at some bars along the Nile under just giant mango trees. They'd set up bars. It'd be pretty cool. You'd be having a good time. Drinks were cheap. There are a lot of, you know, interesting, cool people there, international crowd, locals. But at some point, the drunken soldiers with their guns would come stumbling in. And for me, that was always time to go. And be like, all right, it's time for us to go. Other time, you know, some of my friends would be like, what, it's fun, the DJ's, you know, great, we're dancing, you know, meeting some ladies. It's like, no, it's definitely time to go. And there were times when there was one bar that I left after I left. They had hired a former soldier as a security guard with his rifle, and then other people with their rifles, and they ended up exchanging words. And the former soldier security guard, he had a smoke grenade, military grade tear gas, and he just popped the grenade and dropped it at his feet because he thought that would scare the guys off. That's not really how you're supposed to use those grenades. And a lot of people got sick from that, and they're fortunate that it wasn't more hurt. I did go canoeing on the Nile with a friend. As we were launching our canoe on the Nile, guys were like, "Oh, be careful. Guy just got eaten by an alligator here yesterday." We're like, "Oh, very funny." No, in fact, that was true. A guy had just been eaten by an alligator. The good news is that that was probably the local alligator who's probably full. But one time when leaving one of these clubs, thought I was so smart leaving when the soldiers arrived, but it was pitch black. It's only dirt roads, and I got completely lost on the way home. And I was driving sort of in the village. I was trying to find somebody who spoke English because I didn't speak the local language. And I keep asking, and I knew people didn't know how to get to where we were. We had a very low profile. But I figured if I could get to the airport, I knew how to drive home from the airport. So I asked how to get to the airport, and they're like, "Oh yeah, go this way." I kept going, and I kept following directions, and everybody confirmed, and the paths got smaller and smaller. And then I realized I was on a walking path near on the other side of the airport from where I wanted to be, because none of these people ever drove cars. They didn't know the way to drive to an airport. They always, if they went towards the airport, they walked. So what I did know about that area is A, it was heavily mined, and B, there had been a lot of LRA attacks. I don't know if anybody remembers the LRA, the Ugandan terrorist group that was very active in South Sudan. So, and I was issued a sat phone, but of course my sat phone was out of batteries, and I was in the car, but I had switched cars, and my car charger was in the other car. So now I'm thinking maybe I'm going to die as the dumbest guy on earth. I'm out there in the middle of the African grasslands in an area I know is mine, on a path too small to turn my car around on, in an area where there are a lot of LRA attacks. And oh, by the way, nobody knew where I was. Like, if a lot of people back at the consulate thought maybe I was still at the bar. People at the bar thought I had gone home. That was a really, really dumb situation I'd gotten myself into. I eventually, very carefully and with my fingers crossed, did a 3-point turn onto the grass. Nothing blew up. Was able to find a guy who worked I saw a UN vehicle, and basically went to that guy and just begged him to just drive me back to my consulate. So I got out of that safe, but I was safe through no direct smart moves on my part. That's probably the most dangerous. One of the most embarrassing is when I had a meeting with the White House drunk. So in Afghanistan, in Kabul, the ambassador was having a meeting with the national security advisor. It was late at night because it was business hours in Washington. And so I went to see some friends, and a friend of mine had just opened up his home brew. One of the things about homebrew is you never really know how alcoholic it was. So I just had one. One turned out to be a lot. I was really drunk, but I was like, you know what? I'm off camera for this. I'm a pretty small thing. So I get to the meeting. I'm just off camera. I'm just there to listen. And as soon as I get in the best, I was like, "Oh, Mike, here, I want you to sit right next to me, right up front." So that whole meeting, fortunately, he didn't call upon me, but I was sitting there, and I could tell, I could see on the mirrors, I was doing that classic drunk thing, where you stare at the camera really intently, like, look serious, look serious. But then, sort of start to wander off and look, no, look serious, look serious. Mm-hmm. So that was also very scary for a whole different reason.
Hey guys, I just thought I'd share. So we're going to keep doing these, roughly every month. Actually, Schneider.
I owe you a bio.
Is going to, yeah, I know you owe me your bio. is gonna talk Spider-Man and Insomniac Games, and we're gonna have another 1 or 2 alumni join him that work in the entertainment industry. So that'll be our next discussion. And like I said, we'll try to do these once a month. Anywhere from 40 to 60 minutes, and you'll see some emails and texts out on that probably next week sometime.
Yep.
Mike, thanks for doing this.
All right, thank you so much for having me. It's so great seeing you guys all and sharing some more stories.
Mike,
thanks, Mike.
All right. Good to talk to everybody.
Mike, before you leave,
Where
Mike,
are you
before
now?
you leave,
Where am I right now? Right now, I'm in Washington. I've spent the past year learning the Georgian language. So I'm theoretically about a month away from fluent. That's highly theoretical. And then I'll be going out to Tbilisi, Georgia, to try to, help bring peace there and preserve their democracy, and drum up some business for U.S. firms.
And do they really vote by sticking their thumbs in paint?
They do
That's
that
an
in
obscure
London.
Veep restaurant reference in case you haven't seen the show
Yeah.
Veep.
Yes, not in Georgia, but I have been in places where that really is a way to do it. It's a good way to do it. If the paint can't wash off, you stop people from voting multiple times.
Hey, Mike, I think Steve has a question for you.
It's not quite. It's not a question. It's an offer of sorts. You can. Matt can give you background on me if you want, because I don't know that we've met. I was trustee for the chapter a couple of times, trying to help save the charter back when as a national officer. So that's my connection, and I know a lot of the guys from Gamma Rho who know me as well. So I looked up David Moran. He might be a great connection for you, and some of his background. He was the British, he speaks fluent Russian and German. He was British ambassador to Kazakhstan from 2009 to 2012, charged d'affaires with rank of ambassador throughout 2013 in Georgia. He then moved as the British ambassador from 2014 to 2017 to Switzerland and Liechtenstein. He went back to do some EU exit strategy and global economics for the British government. And he's currently the chargé d'affaires with the rank of ambassador in Armenia.
Oh,
so his name
would be somebody I'd like to meet. Yeah.
His name is David Moran. He's a Theta Delta, Kappa Sig Theta Delta from Alum University. You're welcome to link to me through Facebook or LinkedIn because he's a good close friend of mine. I was his GMC when it was initiated. So
thank you. Yeah, that's fantastic.
So
welcome to our world of networking, right?
Well, my thought is, hey, and he's truly a Kappa Sig at heart. So those connections, the brotherhood connections, will mean a lot to him. And if if he's in Armenia right now, the connection with his background, particularly as ambassador to Georgia for a year, he's got people he knows. So
yeah, awesome. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Thanks for saying, Steve. Hey, Mike, thanks. Appreciate it. Thanks for everybody joining. Have a good night.
Thanks, Mike.